My name is Shannon and I want to thank you guys for joining me and spending part of your morning with me. And because this is a topic that so many people are interested in and have questions about, we are recording this and are going to make the recording available on our Backyard Ecology YouTube channel so that you can review it anytime you want to or share it with your friends as you would like. And for those of you who are joining us live, I have left plenty of time for lots of questions in this webinar. So please put any questions that you have in the chat box, and I will be stopping periodically to review and answer those questions. So when we think about growing native plants, people do it for a variety of different reasons. Some people want to grow native plants because they want to attract more butterflies to their yards. And they know that native plants, not only will the flowers feed the adult butterflies, but the vegetation will often feed the caterpillars, which, of course, if you want adult butterflies, it's really important to feed the babies and have healthy caterpillars. Other people are planting native plants to attract bees and help feed the bees. And fair warning, if you're not doing this yet, once you start really looking at the bees and watching them, oh my gosh, it's such a fascinating world. And there are so many different types of bees. Everything from the big bumblebees and carpenter bees that most of us familiar with, down to little teeny tiny gnat-sized things that many of us, unless we're really paying attention, probably wouldn't even think of as a bee. Attracting hummingbirds is another reason why a lot of people plant native plants. And although we often think of we're planting native plants to provide the nectar for the hummingbirds, the native plants also are supporting the small soft-bodied insects that make up approximately 80% of a hummingbird's diet that most of us never even think about. So growing these native plants for hummingbirds does multiple different things. Not only does it provide the nectar, but it also helps provide the protein that they need in the form of those soft-bodied insects. Attracting songbirds in general is another reason why some people grow native plants. And with the native plants, in this case, again, not only are they producing seeds and fruits that the songbirds can eat, but those native plants are also often supporting small inchworm-type caterpillars and other insects that are vital to baby birds growing up to being strong, healthy adult birds. And then other people, they plant native plants just because they're beautiful and they find the native plants fascinating in and of themselves. And these are just a few of the many, many different reasons why people grow native plants. And like most choices in life, many people make that choice for multiple different reasons. I know for myself, I grow native plants for all of these reasons and more. And no matter why we're growing native plants, there's one basic thing. Well, actually, there's multiple different things, but one of the basic things that we all have in common is deciding when should we plant these native plants. So I want to do something real quick. I am going to launch a poll in the Zoom. And please answer this question. Tell me when it is that you plant most of your plants. And here I'm talking plants, container-grown plants, not seeds as much. And be honest, tell me when you actually do it, not when you think I want to hear because of the topic of this conversation. And I want to give us about 30 seconds to a minute or so to answer this. Okay, that has been a minute, so let me end the poll and we'll share the results. And surprise, 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 it's the spring that most of us are planting our native plants or planting any plants. And that's pretty typical. Honestly, until I started growing native plants, spring was pretty much the only time I thought that you could plant plants. And there's really good reasons for that, and why spring has traditionally been considered, and is still often considered, the planting time. One of those reasons is for psychological reasons. We go through the winter and it tends to be kind of dull and dreary, and depending on where you're at, cold. I'm in Kentucky, so we don't get the snow that often. We tend to have more rain and sometimes ice storms, which I will take the snow any day over the ice. I would much rather have snow. But we've got mild winters by pretty much anybody's standard of definition there, because I can go out in December, go out in January, go out in February, and most years, at least sometime during each of those months, if I look hard enough, I can find at least something blooming. Like I said, at some point. Now, it may be one little bitty yardweed off kind of tucked away in the corner somewhere where it's more protected, but it's blooming, and it may not last long. It may only last a day or two before it gets killed by cold weather again. But still, there's something blooming. That's not a very bad winter at all. But every single year, as the weather starts to warm up and things start to green up, and you can tell, okay, spring's here, I get hit by the same bug and the same itch that everybody else I know does. And that's I want to get outside. I want to play in the dirt. I want to plant something. It's just something that's so innate and ingrained in many of us. And I think part of that goes back to agriculture, which is another important reason why spring is considered the traditional planting time. Because for most of human history, we haven't been able to run down to the corner grocery store and buy our food. We've been dependent on what we could gather, what we could hunt, what we could grow, or what we could raise as livestock. And at least in modern times, most of what we've grown as agricultural crops are annuals, which means we're planting the seeds in the spring so that we can harvest our veggies later in the season. But when we're planting native plants, we're usually not planting them for agriculture, and we're growing very different plants usually. So if we're growing different plants for different reasons, doesn't it make sense that maybe we might want to do things a little differently? And I don't presume to talk about anybody else or for anybody else, but I know for me personally, sometimes when that's just the way it's always been done, I don't always stop to think about why or if there's a better way. And honestly, just because that's the way things have always been done is usually not a good reason for doing much of anything, not in and of itself at least. And for me personally, understanding why and what's going on kind of behind the scenes helps me think through the process and think about things differently. So I want to take a couple of minutes to just go through what's happening with the plants when we plant them at different times of the year, because thinking through this process in this way is what really helped me personally to understand why planting in the fall can be so beneficial for native wildflowers, native trees, and native shrubs. So here's our native plant, and we've just planted it in the spring, just like anybody else would. And because spring is the growing season, everything is immediately telling this plant, grow roots, grow vegetation, grow, 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 grow. And depending on the species and how old the plant is, it may also be trying to prepare to flower and reproduce later in the season. And every one of those activities takes energy. And just like money coming into a budget, there's only so much energy coming into that plant. And so it has to divide that energy up between each of those different activities. In the summer, we have all the same things going on if we plant at that time, except that in addition to all that stuff going on that's going on in the spring, the plant also has the additional stressors of increasing temperatures. It's getting much hotter in the summer. And it's drier. We're not usually getting as much rain. Now, you can plant in the summer. I do it more often than I would like to do because I get busy and don't have as much time in the spring as I would like. And I know I'm going to be busy in the fall. And so summer looks like my best opportunity. It's just not my preferred time. It's not one I would recommend. And it does take more work in order to keep the plants healthy and growing well. But if we plant in the fall and wait, then everything changes. Because the plant is now, most of the vegetation is dying back. So it's putting more energy, not into vegetative growth, but into root growth. And that continues beyond just the fall. Because even throughout the winter, or most of the winter, depending on where you're at, the roots will continue to grow, even after most of that vegetation on top is gone. So research into root growth has mostly been done on crop plants. So we have to make a few inferences here, but it's still, we're pretty safe with those. So most of the research I've read says that root growth slows down at around 50 degrees and then continues to slow down the colder that you get. At what point is too cold and root growth stops really depends on the species. But for most of them, it's somewhere in the lower 40s. Now, this is where it gets exciting because depending on where you're at, your soil may be above that point for most, if not all, of the winter. So in Kentucky, where I'm at, we only have typically maybe a month, if that long, where our soil temperatures are consistently below 40 degrees or in those lower 40 degrees. So for most of the winter, our plants are able to put on root growth. Now, it may be slow. It may not be a whole lot, but any root growth is helpful and beneficial to the plant. So let's walk through this. Here is my native plant seedling that I've been growing as a seedling all season long. Now, I'm going to take a magic wand and make it into two. The reason I'm using a magic wand is because these are now two identical, completely 100% identical plants. Same exact vegetation, same exact root growth, same exact everything. One of them I plant in the fall, and one of them, life happens, and I get busy, and I just don't quite get to planting it. So I have to overwinter it in the pot. It's winter. The one in the ground, its roots are getting settled in. They're kind of doing a little metaphorical stretching because it's not getting that cold. Relatively speaking, mostly that soil temperature is above 40 degrees. I'm getting a little bit of root growth. Everything's going nicely there. The one that I didn't get to, however, well, in the pot, that soil is going to cool down a whole lot faster. So it's not going to have as much root growth. Plus, it's in a pot. So those roots are contained and they're scrunched up and they just don't have as much room to grow and stretch like the one in the ground does. So in the spring, that one in the ground that I planted in the fall, is going to have more root growth. They're going to be more well established and into the ground. And that's going to set it up to be a much stronger, robust plant ready to really kind of take off and grow in the spring. Whereas the one that we overwintered in the pot and didn't get into the ground until the spring isn't going to have that advantage. Now, you absolutely can overwinter plants in the pot. I do it all the time in the nursery because I want to have plants that are more mature, ready to go for my customers who would rather have those more mature plants than a seedling early in the season. I do it all the time for myself and in my personal garden because I get busy and I just don't get everything planted that I wanted to plant. I have friends that do the same thing. Life happens. You do the best you can. But all else being equal, if you can plant in the fall, you're setting that plant up to be stronger and more robust the following season. So, I've talked for quite a bit here. So I'm going to pause and see if we have any questions. Like I said, put questions in the chat box, and I'm going to look at them just a second and see what all we can answer. And then when we get done answering questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we even look for if we're going to buy plants in the fall, because it is different than if we're buying plants in the spring. Okay, one of the questions here is talking about seeding in the fall because they're concerned about heavy winter rains washing away all the seeds. And two things here. First, I'm specifically talking about container-grown plants at this point, not seeds. The process for seeds changes a little bit, but you still want to plant in the fall, winter, usually for native plant seeds. In this case, you're going to want to put something over the top, usually some sort of straw or something like that. If you talk to some of your native seed suppliers or your Natural Resources Conservation Service agents, somebody like that, they're going to be able to give you the best recommendations for your area specifically, because it is going to depend a little bit on where you're at. But you still want to plant a lot of your native seeds, especially if it's a mixture of seeds in that fall, winter time period, because, and this is really important, many of our native plants, their seeds need to undergo a winter before they will germinate. So if you plant those seeds in the spring, the traditional planting season, when we all think of planting, what's going to happen is that the seeds that don't need the winter treatment will go ahead and sprout and grow. But the ones that need the winter treatment, they're not going to sprout. They're going to sit there and they're going to get eaten by things. And some of them are going to desiccate. Some of them are going to rot away. And then next spring, after they've had that winter treatment, anything that's left may sprout. So you really have to think about the whole process here. Okay. Don't see any more questions right now. So we'll keep going. And like I said, when we're buying native plants during the fall, we have to look for different things. Because in the spring, we're a lot of times looking for that really lush, beautiful vegetation. Yeah, that's probably not going to be what you get in the fall. And in fact, one of the things that you're going to have to look at in the fall is that you're going to most likely have signs of insect activity. Unless that plant was grown in a nursery or grown in a greenhouse under cover, or it's been subjected to a lot of insecticides, there's going to be insect activity. What most people traditionally call insect damage on the leaves. Here's a picture of an ironweed that I grew in my nursery and that we sold recently. And you can tell just by looking at it, even from this distance, those leaves are not the prettiest things in the world. If you got a little closer, you could see one of the culprits for at least some of that insect activity. And there's a very good reason why we see more insect activity on the vegetation during the fall than we do in the spring. And that comes down to what's happening with the plant. As the day length decreases, the plant stops putting as much energy into vegetative growth and starts putting more energy down into the roots and in getting ready for the winter. That means it's not replacing the leaves as fast, which makes perfectly sense. Why replace leaves that are serviceable, but that you're going to lose pretty quickly anyway, the new leaves? So here's a closer up view. And in the fall, it gets to the point where almost every single leaf on that plant has some signs of insect activity. Just in this small picture here, I see signs of at least 3 to 6 different types of insect activity on it, including that little inchworm that's munching on the leaf as I'm taking the picture. In the spring, when there's lots of vegetation on there, I can kind of go in and remove the leaves that have been munched on the most. Something like this in the fall, I'd be removing every single leaf out there. It just doesn't work. So instead of looking at this as insect damage and a problem, I've really come to look at it as proof that I'm not using any insecticides on these plants. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at those leaves. You can see it for yourself. In addition to the munched on leaves, you may also find growths, like right here on the plant. And these are called galls. And all it means is that the larva of some midge or fly or wasp, which one it is depends on what type of gall it is, really, has made a home in there and caused the plant to secrete the insect secreted a chemical, caused the plant to make this abnormal growth. On herbaceous plants, don't worry about it. Remember, that's going away anyway in the fall. And come spring, your insect's going to come out. No big deal. You're also likely to see plants that especially your taller plants, that lower portion may have lost most of their leaves. No big deal. They do that. If your taller plants in your garden, a lot of times when we're talking herbaceous native wildflowers, if they start to grow too tall or lose their leaves and you really don't like it, earlier in the season, go through, give them a little bit artificial deer browsing. In other words, trim them off a little bit. And that will often encourage them to kind of bush out more, and it will keep them shorter. So just a little extra hint there. So what are we actually looking for? Here's another ironweed. The deer jumped the fence and nibbled it to the ground earlier in the season. That's why it's so short. Then about a week before I took this picture, the caterpillars decided that they really loved this plant and ate off all the leaves. So not exactly what I would consider the prettiest plant in the world. But here are the roots. And the roots are what you're looking for in native plants that you're buying during the fall, especially for herbaceous plants. Now, for a tree or a shrub, yes, you want to look at this trunk, you want to look at the branching structure and all of that stuff. But the roots are still extremely important because the roots are the permanent part of the herbaceous plants. And they are also pretty much the permanent part of trees and shrubs as well. And when you have roots like this in every drain hole going all the way around the plant, there's no way you can tell me this plant is not a very strong, healthy plant that as soon as you get it in the ground and give those roots room to stretch out and move and grow, that this plant is not going to take off next spring and be absolutely phenomenal. So, with that, I want to stop and give you guys a chance to ask just 1 or 2 more questions here before I share a couple more things at the end here. Okay, there's a question here about, do most native annuals need to have scarification, stratification. Stratification is that winter period that I was talking about. Scarification is simulation of the plant or of the seed going through an animal's gut and kind of getting all roughed up. But asking if the annuals need that too. Some of them, it really depends on the species. And so you're going to have to look at which species you're growing and look up the requirements for each one. Sorry, there isn't a simple answer here for that. Oh, I wish there was. Okay. So, doesn't look like there's any more coming in. So, want to say, if you remember only one thing only from this webinar, I want it to be this, that planting in the fall for your native perennial wildflowers, trees, and shrubs is going to give you a better, stronger, more well-established plant in the spring than if you waited and planted that same plant in the spring after overwintering it in a pot. Now, we all do the best we can, but all else being equal, that fall planting is the time to do it. And so I want to quickly say thank you all for joining me. And if you've enjoyed this and want more resources, I encourage you to check out my educator and author website. And from there, you can find links to our free Backyard Ecology blog, podcast, and YouTube channel, which has all kinds of amazing information on it about gardening for pollinators and wildlife and exploring your nature in your own yard. And you can also find information about our native plant nursery and our habitat consulting work that we do. You can find information about all of my events, my speaking events, my webinars, my classes, all of that, as well as my books. And yeah, I just think that it's a lot easier to send you to one website than to say, okay, here's 3 different websites, go to whichever one. No, go to the one website. It's got links to everything, and you can explore as your interests and desires are. But yes, thanks again so much for joining us, and I wish you a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.